Hello, and welcome to a conversation with myself, Mark Vernon, and Charles Foster. Hi, Charles.
Hello, Mark. Great to be with you.
Charles is the author of many books that are- cover quite a wide range of interest, from the law to theology, perhaps best known for his book Being a Beast, and then most recently Being Human. And my sense is that apart from wider spiritual, stroke theological interests, it's perhaps being a beast, sorry, being human that has brought us to speak now, because it's Charles's very tangible effort to engage with the deep history of what it is to be a member of the species called Homo sapiens. And that's something that concerns me as well, how we tell these big histories about our ancestors in the Paleolithic, in the Neolithic, and into now, and what that means for now. But Charles, look, I mean, I guess there's a huge backstory to how you come to write a book like Being Human and what it entailed writing it. But do you want to just say to people a little bit about what was involved in writing it and why?
The why is probably the easiest. The why is that I wanted to discover what sort of creature I am, because it seemed to me that in order to know what is necessary to make me thrive, to make me happy, what's entailed in behaving well, I have to know what sort of animal I am. And the best way of deciding what sort of animal I am is to try to retrace the journey that I, as an individual human, have undertaken, and the journey that humans as a species have undertaken. And so in this book, I try to inhabit three pivotal moments in the history of the development of humans. The first of those is the Upper Paleolithic, say 40,000 or so years ago, when what is described as behaviorally modern consciousness first ignited. Then we jump to the Neolithic, when the relationship between us and the natural world, which had previously been a very intimate and defining one, became changed. We started to draw lines between ourselves and other species, which we hadn't previously seen as existing. We started to draw lines across the land, walls and fences, to keep other species enclosed, and in a sense to keep them away from us, and also to draw lines across our own minds, to create categories which hadn't previously existed. So I think we became less integrated people at that point. And then I jump a massive amount further into the Enlightenment. Up until the Enlightenment, the world had been seen as an ensouled place, and therefore everything in it had moral significance. One of the great perversions of the Enlightenment was the desoulment of the world, and the reconception of the world as a machine. That was disastrous, because there's nothing obviously wrong about smashing up a machine. There is something obviously ethically dodgy about destroying something with a soul. So the method was in this book, as it was in Being a Beast, to try to inhabit these places, just as I try to inhabit in Being a Beast the sensory worlds of various non-human species. And that method resulted from a conviction that feelings and intuitions are primary, and that ideas which we like to pride ourselves are the things which really move us, are secondary things. They're sort of ex post facto rationalizations of the things which we feel, the things which we intuit about the world. So in order to know what really made us, we've got to know what it felt like to be human at these pivotal points. There is a very good argument that I've missed out some crucial times. So it would have been wonderful to look at that golden age when lots of the major world religions were generated. But it seemed to me that that was a time when there was an evolution of previously existing modes of attention to the world, rather than the eruption of something completely new. So that's what this very strange book is about.
And it is strange because you try to live or re-enter the late Paleolithic mindset, particularly, and then the Neolithic, and then we live in the sort of Enlightenment mindset already. I focused mostly on the Upper Paleolithic because that's in a way where it feels like the energy of the book really is situated, and then there's this sense of things falling away in the Neolithic, and then certainly in the Enlightenment period. You go and spend time in a woods with your son, and really immerse yourself as much as possible. It felt in a way like thinning the modern skin between our sense of vitality and the vitalities around and about us. And, that literally means eating the animals and the things that you find. But it becomes quite a, well, disturbing, but also wondrous experience too, to unpeel some of these layers of the modern mentality as you try to do and see what shows up. I mean, could you just give us a little bit more sense of what it was like to know the world that bit more as ensouled and as part of that ensoulment yourself as well? Because it's not easy, actually.
Yes. So in some ways it was terribly difficult. In some ways it was terribly easy. And by saying it was terribly easy, what I mean is that we all are, as modern humans, basically Upper Paleolithic people. There have been massively more Upper Paleolithic generations of humans than there have been anything else. That's what we really are. So the process of getting back to that time, the process of becoming again the sorts of people that we were then, is just the process of discovering what we really are, which I guess, Mark, is what you are doing with your clients when they come to you for psychotherapy. You're turning them, I would suggest, really back into their Upper Paleolithic selves. But of course, as you know, as a psychotherapist, that is easier said than done. But it seems to me that the real difference between the Upper Paleolithic times and ours is, firstly, that there was a different sort of attention paid to the world then, and a better sort of attention. And secondly, that the boundaries between ourselves and the rest of the world, including the non-human world, were more porous in that time. And we defined ourselves much more in terms of our relationships with everything other than ourselves. So there was a much less hard, carapaced, atomistic understanding of ourselves. When personal pronouns were used in the Upper Paleolithic world, I suspect that they were used in a much more relational sense to include lots of triangulations. So if you asked an Upper Paleolithic person where they were and who they were, they could only define themselves as in terms of all the other beings in the world, which is, I think, what decent people still do. In terms of attention, there was less distraction, and there was a realization, which you can see in the massive explosion of symbolism in the archaeological record at that time, a recognition that there was a lot more possibility in the world than there had previously been seen to be, and a greater possibility in the world than we now see ourselves as having. So, for example, you see for the first time a piece of bone being worked into the shape of a wolf. And if a piece of bone can become a wolf while still remaining a piece of bone, the world is a much more multivalent place than it had previously been. So this was a prismatic age. When you shine white light through a prism, it's revealed as something other than white light, lots and lots of colors. And I think that you see in this very early Upper Paleolithic art an indication of a childlike but extremely sophisticated wonderment at the world. A wonderment which could only be experienced by a particular type of attention to the world. And if we can get back to that appreciation of the way the world really is, by putting aside our modern distractions, we'll be happier and better people, and will understand better the nature of reality, and therefore the sort of relationship to reality which we have to have if we're to be happy in this strange place.
So one of the things which struck me was how rituals, for example, seem quite spontaneously to come back into the weeks that you spent in the forest, in the woods, as a way of relating more expansively to what you sensed around and about. And also that mode, it felt quite naturally blurred what we would call the natural and the supernatural now. That there was a sense of presence that sometimes you could say was the presence of another creature, but at other times was a sense of presence that seemed to be almost, you might say, in another domain that is also here, and that shows up when this different quality of attention gets more alive, becomes more alive.
Yeah.
So that makes some sense.
No, that's absolutely right, I think. So one of the common observations about shamanic cultures is that because they recognize that everything that they have to eat has a soul, that's a problem, because you have to do something morally significant every time you have a meal. And if you kill something and release its soul, that demands a strenuous choreography of appeasement, of oblation and satisfaction. So we, as you say, Mark, found ourselves naturally falling into these choreographic patterns of saying, when we bumped against a tree, "I'm sorry." If we killed something, "I'm sorry, forgive me, I'm going to make good use of your body." It made us more reflectively moral in everything that we did, because since killing something and eating something is a morally significant act, one has to think seriously about the use that you make of the energy which that thing generates. But yes, you also have this blurring of a distinction between the quotidian world of now and other realms. The boundary between them is represented in Upper Paleolithic cave art by the wall of the cave, and you see very early on in the archaeological record those very poignant red ochre handprints, as if people are desperate to get into the world beyond the cave wall. And of course, the shamans did shuffle between the worlds. Yes, it was a strenuous business when they did. They had to undertake ingestion of hallucinogenic substances or profound physiological stresses and so on, and they had to condition themselves by undergoing ritual death and dismemberment often, but those other worlds were accessible. And there's also the sense that when things die, whether humans or otherwise, their agency, which has always been an important part of what they were, actually increases. So the dead are even more active and able to influence the way this world works than we live people are.
So this speaks to the point as well, which I think you make, and you just made now actually, about how this period has its own sophistication, its own complexity and nuance in terms of engaging with the world. It's not a more primitive time in the pejorative sense. I'm very influenced, as I know you know, by this chap, Owen Barfield, who was also interested in how consciousness evolves, by which he meant just our experience of ourselves and the world around us changes for human beings, maybe more than for other animals, who knows, but certainly when we're talking about the last 30, 40,000 years, it's changed very dramatically. And I wonder, well, Barfield would argue, and I have bought this, that each period, if you like, has its own sophistication and its own challenge, its own trouble and its own kind of flourishing. And it came to me then when you were talking about the evidence from shamanic cultures that it's a real trial in order to reach these other worlds for all the life that it brings. And I just wonder whether this makes sense to you, because part of what I got from your book, and Being a Beast as well, actually, was what is it to be a modern human in the sense we normally mean it, someone with a kind of clear sense of their own individuality, even in some significant part, their own autonomy. So exercising things like free will, aware of maybe our unity as individuals. And so we use first person pronouns like I very much more fluidly and commonly perhaps than was used before. But wanting to have that as the kind of platform from which we reach out now, rather than what Barfield would say, and I think there's good evidence for this too, was a much more collective sense of being human. I mean, you might put it like this, that the sense of who you were came from the outside in, and then you use rituals and your sense of belonging and so on to kind of stay in that sphere of shared meaning. Whereas we now tend to think of ourselves, first of all, with our own sense of individuality on the inside, that then tries to reach out and make contact and to be open and so on. We live in a world where meaning can be found rather than meaning having to be negotiated continually in the older mindset. And again, you're nodding. So I'm just wondering, what do you think this is telling you about how to be a 21st century person, looking back, but not just nostalgically, but in order to try and re-inspire what it might be to live now? You've done these very involved experiments as well as the research and trying to write about it too, in 3 different ways there, trying to remake something of what it is, but from now. No Upper Paleolithic person would have thought to write a book about their experience. That's something very contemporary about that. So, what's it telling you about how to be 21st century, but more broadly, expansively in contact with the world in all these different ways, the natural world and what we would call the supernatural world?
Yeah. Well, I broadly agree with Barfield's picture of human history, but I would characterize the shift between the Upper Paleolithic and now as, I'm afraid, a really significant decline. It's not just that in the various ages in between, there have been merely different but equally valid forms of human existence. I think there has been a loss, there has been a bereavement. The change in our self-perception from a self-perception defined by reference to all the relationships of the world to the atomistic one that we have now is one which leaves us very much the poorer. And it's a change which has been aided and abetted by what language has done to us. So you mentioned personal pronouns, Mark. I think that's really important. Our personal pronouns are used obsessively and tyrannously. I have used the word I and the word me thousands of times already in our short conversation, and I use those pronouns in a way that imprisons me. We, in our modern discourse, tend to see those pronouns as an indication of our autonomy, of our freedom. In fact, they're the opposite. When personal pronouns were used in the Upper Paleolithic world, I expect they were used in a way which emphasized our relationality, and therefore emphasized the possibility of discourse, of change, which comes about through relationships with other things. When we started to use language in the way that we do now, the language started to become tyrannous. We started to be ruled by our pronouns rather than using the locus of ourselves as a base from which to explode into wider, rapturous relationality and conversation. So what do we learn about how to live now from looking at the Upper Paleolithic? I think we learn that we've got to become less verbal creatures, or at least we've got to become users of language rather than entities who are used by our language, imprisoned by it. I think we've got to become more explicitly communitarian creatures than we are. We've got to learn to use our freedoms rather than merely assert our freedoms. One of the big quarrels that I have with the whole culture of liberal ethics is that there's lots of lip service to personal autonomy, but we don't use our autonomy. We sit imprisoned at our desks rather than going out and using our freedom in the ways that would make us truly thrive. So we need to go back in order to go forward happily and in a eudaimonic way. And we need to learn again that a single atomistic entity is one which is unrecognized by nature. All nature is ecology. All nature is conversation, and that if we're to be happy, we need to learn the old languages of conversation and relationship. We need to recover the old stories. If I were to be asked what the quintessential modern malaise is, it's that we don't have any story which is sufficient for us. We have just the demeaning story of humans as economic entities. We had better stories back then, and we've got to go back and recover them if we're to have the meaning which we all crave.
No, I'm with you, certainly in the analysis of now, and this sense of having freedoms and not really knowing what they're for. So they become these rather empty assertions of will or expression, but for very confused purpose. They're not so often used for reaching out towards what's good, what's beautiful and true, sort of giving yourself to something. The freedom to give yourself to something feels like the anathema or the opposite of the kind of freedom of preserving my place in the world and possessing, gathering unto myself, as it were. I do understand a lot of that, and it's becoming serious, not just in terms of individual lives and the troubles that people face, but of course collectively, in terms of the environment deteriorating and so on, just consuming the world for our own willful purposes and not knowing really how to do otherwise. Actually, it's a very profound problem You can be aware of what's going wrong and still not know how to do anything about it very much.
Mark, you've asked very generously about my book, but this might be a good bridge to talk about your forthcoming book, Spiritual Intelligence in 7 Steps, which I've read with great admiration and have learnt a huge amount from. But I wonder what, if anything, we agree about in relation to what's necessary for modern spiritual and therefore emotional and psychiatric help. Does it really, as I've suggested in this book, help to go back and retrace our story, or can we diagnose the pathology of modernity sufficiently by talking to our patients, our friends, our families now?
I mean, I think that it's really important to imaginatively go back, if only to disturb the sense that the way we're living now is the most progressive or best or rational or successful way, which is so much part of the scientific myth that there's been progress and we're doing it better than anyone has done before, and with luck those coming after us will do it even more technology, even more knowledge and power and so on. I think that progressive model is very well challenged by accounts of the past, such as you're giving. There's plenty of big histories telling the story of Homo sapiens that don't do that, of course, that do see it in a linear trajectory way. So, for example, shaking off superstition becomes a key part of human development and progress. I think that's completely mistaken. But I also do think, though, that something has been gained perceptually in the modern mind, but it's also our great challenge. And that is that we, I think, can have a sense of the unity of all things amidst the diversity. So, one way of putting this is that modern people are more inclined to, say, theistic religions and even monotheistic religions than they are to polytheistic or pantheistic religions. Now, in the West, we're rather confused about this because our religious situation is so strange compared to the rest of the world. But most people across the planet today adhere in one way or another to broadly monotheistic religions. And I think there's something valuable in that, which is perceiving the side of reality that is one, whether that's conceived in terms of the one God, or it's conceived in terms of non-dual perceptions of things, whether in a more Indian setting, you might have your own devotion to particular gods, but know that that's a manifestation, an incarnation of a unified reality at the same time. And it seems to me the challenge is to become so kind of clear about the nature of that unity that all the diversity can be embraced and related to afresh. I mean, another book, you mentioned my book coming up in the autumn of 2022, I hope, Spiritual Intelligence in 7 Steps. Thanks for that. I've also just published a book about Dante's Divine Comedy. And Dante's, particularly the Paradise, which tends to get marginalized these days, but is so brilliant about presenting images of how we can know ourselves as individuals, but how that can become a kind of portal to knowing and dancing with, moving with all the other reflections of the one being round and about. So for example, in the heaven of Jupiter, he realizes that he can't tell whether the souls with him are saying I or we, which comes to my mind given what we've just been saying about pronouns. So there's something about how when we become more and more ourselves, truly, that's actually the expansive move. And you feel this when you meet someone who is what you might call holy, or seems to channel more than just who they are. They're not actually sort of faceless individuals. They're very particular people, in fact, with a very powerful sense of their presence and personality. And yet that is precisely what enables much more to be present in them too. So I'm feeling that the 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 sort of, and this is what I'm trying to write about, when we're thinking about freedom, when we're thinking about death, when we're thinking about our backstories, when we're thinking about our experience of time, all these facets of our life, to know how to step into the more, but from our particular vantage, that then can become a kind of celebration with others, that might lead to new stories, might lead to new rituals, new I think that what you're doing, and with what I'm doing, is at the vanguard of new ways of writing about these things too. The immersive sense that I get from your writing, it feels like it calls something up inside me that's part of me and you. And yeah, so that's a kind of new configuration perhaps than would have obtained back in the Upper Paleolithic, insofar as we can tell. Does that, something like that, make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It struck me when you were writing about spiritual intelligences, that you were describing what Gilchrist would insist were entirely right hemispherical functions. So they're an indication of modes of attention to the world, which are holistic, which resist being framed in terms of propositions, are less focused, are capable of realizing that the truth might exist in the tension between black and white. He, as you know, reconstructs the history, at least of the modern Western world, in terms of the increasingly dysfunctional discourse between those hemispheres. Is that an analysis which you agree with? Which maps on to your insistence now on the need to recover and rehabilitate and re-emphasize these more spiritual, intuitive types of intelligence?
I mean, it really does. I mean, I've read Ian's book, The Master of His Emissaries. I've actually read some of the new book coming up too.
So it's a wonderful, enormous book.
Yeah. And he's really onto something, which is really important. What's so interesting, though, is that although you can talk about the different personalities, the different ways that the two hemispheres approach the world, we only have one consciousness. It is somehow united in us. Now we can feel fragmented. We can even become psychotic and so on. So that can break down. But there's something about the unity of our attention, which is really important. So although these two hemispheres are there and they can be studied, particularly when something goes wrong with one or the other in an individual, it's something about bringing both together that's really important. And when Ian does his analysis of the cultural past, for example, the Renaissance period is one that he celebrates as having a good balance between these two perceptions becoming one perception. And I think you see this in Renaissance pictures, say, of individuals. I mean, just think of a very famous Renaissance picture like the Mona Lisa. There's definitely an individual there, who we call the Mona Lisa, and then wonder who she might have actually been and so on. But she's set in these great vistas. And so the nature within which she's set, the mountains and the rivers moving off to the distance, often the rivers are showing their bends and meanders as if they're alive too. It's something about the both and of that I think is so appealing in those works of art. They feel like they're satisfying. They're telling us something really profound, because in the looking at them, to appreciate them, these different sides have to come together, of both the individual and the shared. So I think that there's big hints for us in terms of moving forward. And then people turn to maybe things like psychedelics, or they turn to spiritual practices. They turn to the more shared sense of things, maybe football matches and music concerts and so on, where in the first instance, we feel our sense of self being lost, and maybe even the ego feels a bit smashed. But I also know from the psychotherapeutic work that that is not a good state of mind to have for any length of time. You know, if you go into mental health wards, you can find plenty of people whose ego is more or less permanently smashed, and that is not a great way to live at all. So there's something about recovering the more shared sense, but integrating it into who we are now, that I think is the real challenge. And I think that's, you know, in a way, that's the work of psychotherapy. It's to be able to know yourself, know your troubles, but that becoming just part of the wider sense that your being is shared with other beings and ultimately is part of one being. I feel that when we have that, what traditionally might have been called more mystical realization, that can become more general in the population, not just be something that a few adepts have who've lived in a cave half their life, but actually can become a much more widespread experience. That for me gives us a big hint about the way forward. And I think the upside of now is that that perception is becoming much more widespread. It's not just the possession of a few elites, it's possession of men and women, even in quite ordinary ways of life, becoming more accessible now. You know, so that's part of the impulse behind me writing my book, because I feel this is so important that it can be shared. It needs, strangely, it's a sort of a mystical experience or mystical realization, but it also needs demystifying. I think it is actually a much more widespread experience. And that we need to surface that, and so have that then feed back into our lives. So we talk about death, we talk about time, we talk about our backstory in ways that are fully influenced by that perception that actually our being is shared, even as we have our own particular advantage to know that shared being. It's something like that that I feel is the way forward.
So mindfulness meditation puts together the right and the left hemisphere, and also increases our realization of the permeability of the membrane which separates us from beings other than us. If everyone did half an hour mindfulness meditation a day, would you be out of a job as a psychotherapist?
No, because I think that mindfulness as a standalone activity can be used in all sorts of different ways. I mean, you know, the slightly cliche way of putting this now is that the American military sniper can use mindfulness very well in order to make him a more effective killer. You know, mindfulness is just paying attention. So the question is then what you're paying attention to. And if you're paying attention in such a way that's, say, informed by a wider worldview, that's going to color what you see. So if your worldview is, say, the competitive marketplace, which is why people in Silicon Valley like mindfulness too, then it might make you better competing. But it is originally a spiritual practice where it was one of the tools or skills, capacities, if you like, that you could develop in order to know more fully the nature of reality as such. And so when you're also doing the metaphysical work, you might say, which is going to be partly intellectual, and having that knitted together with the mindful practice, then I think that you can, it's likely to calm people because it makes them more connected with a wider reality. And so maybe then psychotherapy would be seen as a sort of transitional or intermediate phase too. Yeah, that could feed into this bigger picture as well. Yeah.
You think I'm being hopelessly romantic, guilty of unscientific noble savagery to suggest that upper Paleolithic people were more mindful in the sense in which we talk about it now?
Well, I think that they were much more alert to the natural world. Maybe were more alert to other things. Maybe were more alert to analytical language, which, you know, wouldn't mean anything to them if you try to speak it. I'm partly thinking of encounters between modern people and indigenous tribes, and how there's a very powerful sense that they're alert to all sorts of things, but they're having to actively engage with the world around them as well. But they do it through rituals, through consulting the gods, maybe through divination practices, um, through surviving, but knowing how to use plants and animals in ways that just wouldn't occur to us. So there's agency and activity, which no doubt can be stressful and anxious provoking as well, but just in different ways to our own anxieties and concerns, which are much more in our times um, originating from feeling separate from the world around us rather than having to navigate a total immersion experience of the world around them. So I guess I suppose I think things get reinvented, both the sense of connection and the sense of disconnection, but they're qualitatively very different. And then that comes up when we have encounters with indigenous tribes.
But isn't our ease with analytic language, our familiarity with abstractions, actually an indication of pathology? Doesn't it mean that we live in entirely virtual worlds, self-created worlds, self-referential worlds, and therefore self-reverential worlds, which precludes the possibility of real consummated relationship with reality?
My sense is that has got out of balance now, that reason is taken to be sovereign very often now, particularly in the sciences or in scientific enterprises like the human sciences, as well as the hard sciences, and that's a mistake. But I think that figures perhaps you alluded to a little while back earlier in our conversation, say from the axial period, figures like Plato in the West, others in other parts of the world, they knew that reason can be in the service of the wider exploration of reality. So reason then is primarily a kind of process of discernment, so that you can inhabit more fully the world around and about, but without just getting lost in it, sort of dissolving in it, merging into it. So, for example, Dante portrays this very well, I think, that particularly in the Paradise, his journey through the heavenly spheres, which is really a journey into a deeper and deeper perception of reality, there's two things happening at once. Partly it's his love and his desire and the beauty, the sheer experience drawing him in, but with Beatrice, his guide, they have a lot of conversations, and she, as it were, continually helps him to fine-tune his perception of the light that is coming towards him. And that's really necessary, because otherwise it would just overwhelm him. But as he's able to adjust his sense of himself with his mind, with his heart, with his guts even, you might say, he's able to stay himself and know himself more and more fully connected to the world around. And I think that intellect and reason in the service of that better immersion and connection is what we need to recover. Or maybe it's even partly to sort of make for the first time, because when you discover the power of reason, as it were, it can easily become sovereign. It can take over and then leave you alienated and split off from half of reality, which is probably the most vital and important part. But not to dismiss reason. I think it's got a crucial purpose and function, I think, when it's in the service of this wider exploration and connection. Participation would be Owen Barfield's big word.
Yeah. Well, since you're here and you're talking to me free of charge, let me throw myself on the couch. So I'm looking out of the window now, and I can see a tree, and I'm getting visual images from that tree, and I'm translating them almost immediately into things which have nothing whatever to do with that tree. Remembered physiological facts about trees, remembered fragments of poems about trees. I've never seen a tree, and that seems to me to be unfortunate, because I expect that trees are much more interesting, colourful and charismatic and complex than Charles Foster's thoughts about trees. What am I to do?
Well, I think you can consider all those different fragments of what people have said about trees that come to you as you look at the tree, to help you to imaginatively engage with the tree more fully. And I think imagination here is really crucial because imagination is a truth bearing capacity. It does connect us with the world, and we can have fantasies and make mistakes, but using the capacity we have for discernment, we can realize the things in our perception that actually connect us rather than disconnect us, or maybe show one aspect but also will therefore exclude another aspect. So the scientific account of the tree will tell you something about the trees, even its inner life, in terms of its physical inner life, what's going on beneath the surface bark of appearance. But what the poet might tell you about the life of the tree and how it's swaying in the wind would, in an older consciousness, also be felt to be a swaying in the consciousness of the world of the forest, say, because the word for wind, breath, and spirit, pneuma, and in other languages was all one. The poet will draw that out and convey that to you now. But then also, if you've read indigenous peoples' accounts of trees and the shamanistic accounts of trees, or maybe read some of the old North myths, or even in Christianity and the role of the sacred tree upon which the Christ figure died, then you'll know that the tree also has a sacred presence that's communicating another aspect of reality again towards you. So consciously bringing all these things to mind maybe creates a rainbow of your experience of the tree, rather than leaving you just feeling, these fragments, what am I going to make of them?
Thank you. I'll get to work on trying to see trees and we'll report back.
Look, there is a really serious part to all this, because I do completely share with you the sense of the desperation of our times, which comes up in the lives of individuals and their suffering, but also thinking about the environment and the sense of impending collapse if we don't quickly get to grips with these things. But what I do also like is that this isn't just a tale of disaster, but also one of possibility. So whilst there is a sense of loss, as you're saying, coming to terms with that loss can sort of become the energy to try and re-engage as well. It helps to stress the imperative of re-engaging. So that's why I'm as much interested in how the backstory tell about ourselves informs the present for what might be the future story of ourselves. We're not just telling ourselves stories of utilitarian struggle and desperation, which I think is kind of how we feel now, really, rather than how people felt back then. It's really important to retell these stories to inspire the present and so renew it, because it is a pressing concern. It really is a pressing concern.
Yeah.
Which is to say, I'm very grateful for your efforts. Because writing a book, as Barfield said, is this tremendous effort to put into words, to put into a clear consciousness as possible what is otherwise felt and perceived. And that's very much part of the work of now. Which is partly to say to people, do read these books, do read Charles's books, read mine as well if you're so inclined. Yeah.
Yeah. And I say in the book that I'm really worried about coming over as a grumpy misanthrope, just moaning about the appalling people that we've now become. And I go on to say that I'm grumpy and disappointed simply because I realize what glorious creatures we are and can be. And I am very hopeful about the future of the human race. I think we're wonderful animals, and we can discover something about our wonderfulness and how to recover our wonderfulness by these retrospective journeys.
Thank you very much. Look, just tell people where they can find more about your work, books, and otherwise, with a website or something like that, I guess.
Website www.charlesfoster.co.uk. There's a list of publications there should anybody want to read anything by me.
And for myself, do have a look at markvernon.com with books past, current, and indeed future soon to appear on the website. But Charles, look, it's very nice to touch base and tease some of these things out. I guess we've just started, really, so we should speak again as our own sense of these things develops. Because we're both very actively engaged in trying to communicate these things for now. So that'd be really good to do.
I've very much enjoyed our conversation. Thank you. Look forward to continuing the conversation. Yeah.
Thank you.